So welcome. This is an informal gathering. So before I begin, I'd just like to say that the session is being recorded. It will only be broadcast later. But if you don't want to be recorded, please just switch off your cameras or microphones. Otherwise, please feel free to participate. This is yet another session as part of the series on the living memory of cities. I believe this is the 8th session that we've been organizing at Eric Parry Architects in collaboration with London Metropolitan University. And for those of us who have been following this series on cities, you'll perhaps be happy to know that alongside these sessions, we at Eric Parry are also organizing a series on sacred space. I don't particularly like the phrase sacred space. Maybe we should talk about the speciality of the sacred or the theology of art and architecture, but I'll leave that open. That's a series we're doing in collaboration with Father Peter Newby, who's also with us tonight at Emeritus University. And that series is entitled Presence, Person, Beauty. So that will begin next week with the talk by Professor Elizabeth Theokritoff of the Institute of Orthodox Christian Studies in Cambridge. Today we'll have with us Professor Kenneth Frampton, who will be talking to us about megaform as urban structure, as urban landscape, sorry. As always, the proceedings will be very simple. The session is chaired by Eric Parry, we have on our screen. Eric will do a brief introduction in a few moments. And this will be followed then by Kenneth's presentation, which should be 30 minutes or so, and then a similar period for questions. So in total, we're talking about 1 hour or so. Let's see, I mean, in all freedom. From London Met, Nick Temple, Matthew Barac, Christian Frost may perhaps like to ask a few questions to start us off. Before Eric opens it to the floor. I shouldn't like to put anybody on the spot. I can see a number of people on my screen that I would certainly like to hear from on a more personal basis. But of course, within the time available, and I don't think we can afford more than half a dozen questions or so. But I'll leave that to Eric, of course. And now I think maybe Matthew would like to say something on behalf of London Met. So Matthew, if you please.
Good evening. Thank you, José, and thank you, Eric and colleagues. It's great to see you again. It's exciting to have the second series starting in what has become a snowballing series, which we have high hopes for in terms of the possibility of all getting together in a conference next year. But we'll take each day as it comes, as we've learned very much in recent years and months. So from our point of view, we have some web pages available for the living memory of cities, which you're all very welcome to follow. And those include an archive, a video archive of all of the past events, which are available through the Centre for Urban and Built Ecologies at London Metropolitan. But really just it's exciting to be starting again with José and our wonderful colleagues at Eric Parry Architects to enjoy the second series, which our thanks again to José, to our research assistant, Anna Parr, and our incoming research assistant, Kirsten Thompson, for all of the help in putting all of this together. And we welcome all the new visitors and those who have returned again this year. So over to Eric to chair the session.
Thanks indeed, Matthew. I just wanted very briefly to reflect on a personal memory that it was back in 1976 that I became a student of Kenneth's at the Royal College of Art, where he, apart from memorable criticism, gave a set of 2-hour lectures to a very small audience, really. We were very privileged on the European city. And that amongst whoever it is could turn off their mic, that would be helpful. Can we not control that? Sorry, it's difficult. Okay, sorry, just going back to that. So those wonderful, wonderful lectures, in the midst of which he referred to Dalibor Vesely, and I then went on to be taught by Dalibor at the Architectural Association as a necessary part of getting qualified. And then to Cambridge, where many of us here present were connected to. So I just wanted to refer to the resilience and the clarity with which Ken, all those years ago, gave us students a great footing, which I believe was absolutely foundational and important. Those chance encounters are remarkable events, and actually looking at the back at the gift of Kenneth's to the CCA, there's a letter that I find incredibly charming from Robin Middleton, a colleague again from Cambridge, AA, and then Cambridge, in which he says, asks Kenneth, would you care to write a history of modern architecture for a Thames and Hudson paperback, similar to their books on surrealism or pop art? They envisage it as a great popular success, read by every student, recommended by all teachers, so there might even be money in it. Let me know, and I will give you the details. That was the 2nd of May, 1968, coming from the editorial department of architectural design. And I therefore just want to sort of reflect on the very human and social side of gatherings, and what an event like tonight may hopefully spark in many of us attending. It's essential. The connectivity is just an essential part of creative life. So, Ken, thank you so much for doing this, and we're really looking forward. And I'll pick up the questions at the end.
Thank you very much, Eric. Thank you. I'm very happy to be here, of course, and I'm very honored to be invited to participate in this series. And so without any more ado, I will try to start. Actually, the title, Living Memory of Cities, in some ways kind of made me feel that I was somehow not exactly in line with what was implied by this, but nonetheless, here I am, and with this strange title, and with some thoughts about the fate of cities, because I think, as everyone knows, I'm sure it's so commonplace that where historical cities still exist and are well maintained, and it's really a question, of course, whether London as a historic city has been well maintained or not. I'm really thinking of the skyline, and I'm reminded of a chance encounter with a postcard with a newspaper article in the 60s in Germany with the title "The Death of the Postcard," and there the main argument of the journalist was that, the images of cities, which was sort of Baedeker's image of the city, I suppose, most purely around 1910 or just before the First World War, that was no longer, that image, which was the subject of postcards, was no longer possible in many instances because the city crown of the cathedral was totally compromised by high-rise buildings on the periphery, and that is also, of course, true in the case of London. So, but in general, I suppose we can say that historical cities are sort of, in Europe at least, well, they probably don't exist much elsewhere, are more or less intact, and one can speak of them as a living memory in itself. But when it comes to the phenomenon of urbanization and and the advent of the megalopolis, which I think, of course, is first recognized as such in '62 by Jean Gutmann in a book of that title, the megalopolis, which is everywhere, the urbanized region, in fact, the continuous urbanized region. This destiny which we all live in, this is a de facto condition which it seems we will never escape, of course. And the 3 volumes recently produced by London School of Economics, The Endless City, prophesies, well, it says, like 50% of the world's population live in urbanized regions as of 2007, when the 3 volumes were published by Phaidon, and that it's projected that by 2050, which is not so far away, 75% of the world's population will live in urbanized regions. It likes to use the word cities instead of urbanized regions, but of course we know that megacities, and I just read only last night, in fact, that it's projected that Cairo, for example, of all places, will soon become, or certainly by that date, a 40 million city. These populations are kind of more and more bizarre when you compare them to nation states. Above all, let's say, to the nation state of Iceland, which I believe tops out at 300,000 people. So not so difficult to vaccinate. In any case, this has been in the offing for quite a while. And recently, about maybe 3 years ago, I rather forget, I noticed in the Museum of Modern Art this very strange quote from Mies that had been, it seems, abstracted from an interview that Mies gave in the mid-40s, when he'd only been in the States, not yet a decade. And it goes along as follows. That is why we can't build cities anymore, planned cities, old cities. It goes on like a forest, he says. And we should have to learn to live in the jungle and even do well by that. And I somehow think that I can't quite remember, in fact, it can be compared to Gertrude Stein's pithy remark, there is no more there, and as a kind of fate that has happened to the whole idea of, let's say, designing cities for that matter. I recall in Harvard, Jerzy Zoltan standing up at a conference and saying, what would happen to surgery if it's never practiced? And the point of his rhetoric was, we don't practice urban design, notwithstanding the School of Urban Design in the GSD. And so, hence Megaform as urban landscape. And I suppose, well, I'm not, by the way, the image here, which is pretending to be a megaform, is in fact Hans Scharoun's 1929 Breslau building exhibition. And it's a cover of a lecture I gave in Urbana, University of Illinois, Champaign-Urbana, in 2008 as a professor there. It was a part of the deal that one had to publish an address. And this is it, very nicely produced by them. Next, please. And this shows the extent of this megaform, which, by the way, is sort of a little collective housing scheme for bachelors with a sort of central communal space. But the topographic character of this continuous megaform, I think, is evident both, at grade level, but also in its own fullness, so to speak. Next. And something similar can be said of Aalto's Baker Dorm, 1944 in in MIT, and with its central communal restaurant, of course, and this sort of undulating cliff wall, a kind of metaphor perhaps for the Charles River, which is just by the side of it. In any case, more importantly, it belongs to this, you could say Middle European, decidedly German tradition of big building form, gross Bau form, and I mean, I think it is, what I'm trying to say, I suppose, is that it's definitely influenced by that. And of course, it also has a very strong topographic character. Next, please. This brings me to the other kind of, this is somewhat of an interjection, because I suppose what I have in mind with megaforms, or the potential of megaforms, let's say, is that they can function, or they, however pathetically, they try to function as urbanization in miniature, cities in miniature, as a there as opposed to a nowhere, as per Marc Auger's book, Non-lieu. And so this is a shot, of course, of the, actually of the Galerie d'Orléans. Well, we were in the arcades running around the perimeter of the Palais Royal in Paris, that in its, what you could say, final form, 1780, under the sponsorship of Louis Philippe, was a final and total transformation of the Palais Richelieu, 17th century, into a place of commerce at many levels. Next, please. And here, you know, from this great book by Johann Friedrich Geist, Passagen, we have the plan of the Palais Royal, and also, you know, towards the bottom of this plan, the Galerie d'Orléans. And actually, if you look very closely around the kind of heavy black perimeter, there are these this double line of terraces, so that in a way, this free port, this privileged royal plot of ground was capitalized twice, if you like. And then this plan is accompanied, of course, on the right with, interestingly, I think, with the technology celebrated by Walter Benjamin, of course, in his own magnum opus, Arcades. You know, this technology, ferrovitreous technology, which was essential to realizing Galleria. And I will come back, I hope, during the course of the lecture, to this relationship between form and technology. Next, please. And this, of course, is the Galerie d'Orléans. The data, I think, 1829 to 1833, and designed by Percier et Fontaine. And here it is, of course, under construction. And you can see the major residential perimeter of the Palais Royal in the background. Next, please. And here, of course, is the space itself. This again, much celebrated by Walter Benjamin, and this center of conspicuous consumption, luxury goods trade illuminated from above. This gallery and this typology we will encounter again in the course of this lecture, but not in this form. Next. So this in my view, yes, was the kind of prototypical city in miniature. Michel Verne makes the point, you know, that everything under the rubric commerce took place here. You know, political clubs and deals and stock options and prostitution and God knows what took place in this free port. And also the revolution, in fact, is Camille Desmoulins starts a certain aspect of the revolution in the center of the Palais Royal. None of this happened in the case of Rockefeller Center, of course, 29 to 39, I mean, built out of the Depression on oil money, of course, and there is this famous moment, of course, when Diego Rivera paints actually a beautiful mural, Man at the Crossroads, which is finally painted out because the Rockefellers, with all their free thinking, could hardly tolerate the images of Marx and Lenin in the center of this, well, I don't think they use the word city in miniature, but it is a kind of parallel in my opinion. Next, please. This is the Centre Pompidou in Paris by Renzo Piano, Richard Rogers, of course, and with its 40-meter span, tubular lattice beam. This is technology itself. Of course, it is a machine for exhibiting art. It is the building as a huge machine. In fact, of course, it has been compared to an internal combustion engine, perhaps not so much internal as on the exterior, namely the escalators which carry the visitors, many visitors, of course, up to the top of the building for panoramic views of Paris, and then down again and out, never actually entering to the galleries themselves. And of course, services on one side and human beings on the other, in both cases in tubes. I remember a conversation exchange between Alan Cahoon and Richard Rogers over the colors used on the services side, with Richard claiming that they were coded according to what they contained, and Alan, of course, maintaining that the whole operation was entirely decorative. Next, please. And this is something quite different. It's earlier, of course. It's 1953. It's never built. It's Alto. It's Vogelwiedplatz in Vienna, a kind of sports center and a stadium. And here, of course, we are very aware of the form. It is a kind of organic, one might even say, meta-topographic form. It somehow, suggests a small mountain, maybe. And it is, of course, cable-suspended construction, I believe designed by his engineer's son, actually, if I remember correctly. Next, please. And here, of course, we have also advanced technology, but in contrast to Centre Pompidou, this is advanced technology used in relation to a form, and to a megaform, I would argue, and this is why, of course, this image appears here. Next, please. Well, vis-a-vis designing cities from scratch, or anyway, expansions of cities from scratch, and this, of course, is Ile-de-France Cerdà's 1858 plan for the expansion of Barcelona. And I use it here because, it is a plan that is realized. I suppose it must have taken the rest of the 19th century to actually finally fill it up, so to speak, or more than fill it up. And served by trams, of course, from the point of view of public transport, and also, of course, by railroad. Very much a city of the technocrat. In fact, it is this technocrat who coins the term urbanization, and as all words that end with ization, it insists on process. It is process itself, as opposed to projecting a city or the idea of the civic. I mean, urbanization is somehow a process, and you could, I suppose, argue, and I'm sure it has been argued, or may even, I'm ignorant of this, have been in Cerdà's mind. It is, of course, somewhat American. It's just, the fact that it's a square grid perhaps is not particularly American, but the fact that it's a grid at all, and also the fact that this grid is intercepted by a diagonal, hence one thinks of Broadway intercepting the grid of Manhattan. There is a kind of an American character, I think, to this very remarkable work. Next, please. And much later, of course, and equally remarkable, and also related in a way very much so, even more so than in the case of Cerdà, is this really phantasmagoric project by the great guy, Le Corbusier, in 1929, the same date as the beginning of Rockefeller Center. It will, of course, be the prototype for the Plan Obus for Algiers that will be projected a year later by him. And what it reminds me of, as we're on the topic, is of, in a funny way, of the Smithsons, which I don't have. I ought to have that image, but I don't. The Smithsons London Road study of 1953. And why? Because I think at that time, the Smithsons, and maybe not just the Smithsons, had this intuitive sense that the only thing that could be relied on was the autoroute, that there was no other principle of order that was possible in the post-war expansion of capital cities, London in particular, so that the built fabric, which also had a somewhat gallery-like character, was built on top of the road in their London Road study, of course, none of which was actually realized. Next, please. And this is Bakama, Tel Aviv, a decade later, 1963, if I remember correctly, and not realized, of course. It's an urban intervention. And I think that this issue of intervention, I think that the idea of the megaform is an idea of intervention. There's one of these semicircular things, I think it's the one nearest to us, is actually Dizengoff Circle, slightly projected as expanded by Bakama. But then there is this spine road, which is built on top of an autoroute. So it is a bit like I think it's not on top of, it's adjacent to the autoroute. It's a little bit like, it is obviously influenced by Le Corbusier's 1929 project for Rio de Janeiro, which is what we were just looking at. The project unifies Tel Aviv and Akko and the pre-existing Arab port, and there's a town hall, etc., somewhat evident. And all of this is in relation to what was then the White City. Now totally, well, it's still there, sort of, but totally overwhelmed by the Manhattanization of Tel Aviv, which is also, it was endless kind of nondescript towers, one after another, exactly as is happening here in New York ad infinitum. Next, please. So this is 1961. It is this amazing plan for Hook by the LCC's Architects Department just before its total dissolution, and not built for, because the central government wouldn't put its weight behind. There was local opposition, of course, but this is in many respects such a rational, overspill city with autoroute connection and rail connection to London, and is a definite place. You can see that it has this in mind, this sort of central core, which presumably would have been largely pedestrianized, built up in the center, with also a certain amount of zoning of light industry to the periphery, etc., and so on, and the interspersing green areas. So next, please. Which is totally other. What got to be built, of course, as you all know, is a decade later, at least inaugurated a decade later in 1972, Milton Keynes, and as designed by Llewellyn Davis, Forestry, Weeks and Bohr, above all, of course, by Walter Bohr, who was the kind of urban planning handshow in that partnership. And this, of course, might be a little mythic, but I think there is some truth in this, that Melvin Webber, who had an American planner, who came up with the slogans, community without propinquity, non-place urban realm, in his book, Explorations in Urban Structures, which I think is 1963, was in residence, I think, in University College London during the time that it was no longer a school of architecture under Llewellyn Davis, but in fact a school, I think, of environmental studies, because what could be worse than being a school of architecture? Such is the ideology of titles. And so I think this work, which is a kind of rather absurd kind of it would be prejudicial to say it's a kind of mini Los Angeles superimposed over rather resistant topographic reality of the Buckinghamshire countryside, which explains another kind of weird ideological thing, that this is ostensibly a 1 kilometre square grid, the British, of course, being in the throes of joining the European Union, which it has now abandoned, so that on the one hand, it's an American planner's ideas, and a rather Americanized grid, that in the end doesn't really intend a city at all, but literally what he was talking about, non-place urban realm, community without propinquity, of course, dependent totally on the automobile. I mean, of course, there is public transport, but it wasn't, unlike Cerdà's Barcelona, it was not designed for public transport, for a rationalized light rail system. Next, please. And here, again, to come back to something which I will now sort of boringly insist on, is the possibility of urban intervention. Because although this project was not carried out, it is by Mario Botta and Luigi Snozzi. It is a project for Zurich, for the Hauptbahnhof in Zurich, with its covered platforms extending behind the kind of somewhat Baroque terminus. It is this project of augmenting the public and administrative provisions of the terminus with a bridge-like building. I mean, aqueduct buildings were very popular at that moment in Italy, I mean, theoretically, and in the Ticino, where of course they both came from. Under that influence, the building as an arcade, or yes, well, really, no, more importantly, as a bridge. And here the interesting thing, or at least to me, is that the railroad enters Zurich and crosses over this tributary of the Limmat, which you see here, just by the side of the bridge element, the river, Seal River, feeding into the Limmat. And then Botta does this kind of slightly absurd thing of planting the roof of the bridge to continue, as it were, the vegetation along the bank of the Seal River. Yes, I mean, in that sense, it's conceived, clearly as an urban intervention. Next, please. And a very important urban intervention of 1996 is this block in Barcelona, and is on the Avenida Diagonal of Barcelona, which I remarked on with regard to the Cerdà plan, and this is, of course, inserted into the built Cerdà plan. And it is by Rafael Meneo and Manuel de Sola Morales. And I think I'm indebted to de Sola Morales for this idea of urban intervention. Actually, it's de Sola Morales who will use this term urban acupuncture. And I suppose you could say that this intervention is a kind of urban acupuncture. In any case, what's fascinating for me about it is that it is this kind of, stepped, organic, continuous block with pierced windows. And it's primarily an office building. There is a hotel tucked away here somewhere in the school, but it's first and foremost in terms of the main mass an office building. And these windows, it's always seemed to me that the developer or somebody had in the back of their mind that if there should be a moment in time which should perhaps arise in Manhattan sooner or later, but also maybe could arise in Barcelona or anywhere for that matter, a surplus of office space, the whole thing could be converted more easily to residential fabric by virtue of the pierced windows than would otherwise be the case if it were, for example, a curtain wall, which in most of high-rise buildings in Manhattan at the moment is like the never-ending curtain wall. the manufacturers of glass must have done extremely well out of out of current speculation. And the other thing which will come up again, because I have the section of this thing, is that in a way the traditional shopping frontage of the Avenida was resuscitated by virtue of the Galleria inside this building, which you're perhaps all very familiar with. Next, please. And so here's the Galleria, and of course it's sitting on top of, what is it, 4 levels of parking at least, if not more. These higher floors that are on top of the 4 levels, I'm not quite sure what their allocation is, to be honest. But you can see how the building is wrapped around this Galleria. You can see also the Avenida is on the right of this section. So you can see how the populace using the shopping mall of the Galleria can easily spill out onto the Avenida and therefore revitalize the shop fronts, commercially speaking. So this is it's not exactly a city in miniature, of course, because nobody lives there, unlike the Palais Royal, but it has certain attributes. It is, of course, very much a place of commerce. And okay, next, please. So this building is 2002, I think, the design. It's realized I can't remember the exact dates. I think 2002, 2005, by a very young practice in London, which no longer is in existence. Then the founding partners were Alexander Zeropolo, the Spanish architect, and Farshid Musavi of Iranian origin, and they both been studying the AA, and they entered this competition when they were in the AA, and they won it. And it is, of course, kind of morphological masterpiece, if you like, in terms of the use of the computer for achieving such forms. And indeed, the top of this complex building is both timber and park surfaces, and that timber, the way the timber is laid, it wouldn't have been possible without a computer. Next, please. And it's just the only point I show this site plan, that it's isolation, but you can see, of course, the megalopolis more or less continuing in the main mass here with the stadium, another kind of megaform in a way. Next, please. And then, of course, something of the top of this thing. And well, the interesting thing about it is that it's a composite program. It is a pier, it's a kind of park. It is, of course, above all, a ferry terminal, but also it contains a theatre. So it has a complex program, and I think that idea of a complex program in a megaform is what I have in mind, if such megaforms could, also be cities in miniature. Next, please. And here then is again, is this question of technology and form. Here, of course, what's extraordinary about this work is that the morphological manipulation of the form is very consequent. It's very kind of, it's based on a spine, unlike other examples that one can think of at that time, just after the millennium. Next, please. Okay, Robson Square. This is 1986. It's designed by the late, they're both late now, Arthur Erickson and Cornelia Oberlander. Erickson, architect, of course, and Oberlander, a very distinguished Canadian landscape architect. And so this building is, it's a composite because the roof is actually regional law courts stepped, opening to a kind of common civic space under this translucent roof, space frame roof. And then it's a municipal building. There's this ornamental pool, which I think has a marriage room somehow overlooking it. I'm not quite sure about that. And then, you know, this pool, of course, cascades down. And also, well, you know, I've always assumed this, but I'm not entirely sure, but I assume that the public are taken to the top of this level by elevator, and then they walk down this cascading park and so on. It's in Vancouver, and it ends up, you can just see the copper roof of a pre-existing classical building, art gallery, at grade, at the ground level. Next, please. And, well, that's the section. And of course, it shows, of course, parking. The one thing I didn't mention with regard to the Ila block is that the suburban population living outside of the Sardar expansion would come to the Ila block by automobile, and that explains all this multi-level parking. Here, the multi-level parking is not attached to commerce, but to the regional law courts and to the municipality. It's not, it doesn't have the same function and isn't as many levels either. Next, please. And this is the plan. And you can see these kind of ramps that conduct the people down the parkscape. And to the left, you can see the roof. And to the right, you can see the pre-existing art gallery. Next, please. And this is a rather awkward term, stramps, for this combination of ramps and stairs, which could well be an Oberlander invention, but I'm not entirely sure about that. Next, please. And here, Alto, 62. What I want to just very quickly suggest with this image, which was not carried out, beautiful project, I think, for the center of Helsinki, actually for rail on the rail is not very clearly shown, but you'll see it in a minute in the plan, and the entry of auto routes, like the two stages of infrastructural layering into the center of Helsinki with these flatted landscape elements, which are in fact parking garages, and beyond lies the lake of Tulu and projected cultural buildings, of which only one, Finlandia, was ever actually realized by Aalto. Next, please. And here the plan, of course, it shows you more clearly the relationship between the railhead coming into the Saarinen terminal and the auto route. You can hardly make it out, but coming along the side of the rail system. I mean, exactly how the cars get in, that remains somewhat of a mystery, but anyway, you get the general idea. Next, it's very much a landscape idea. And these are my last two images. I've gone on a bit long, I'm sorry to say. It's Mendes da Rocha. It's a 2008 project for Paris. And it's a so-called sports boulevard. It was part of the French bid for the Olympiad of 2012. Actually, this project is dated 2008. So it was part of a package that the French put together to try to get the Olympic Games, which they were not successful in doing. And this was never, nothing was, it was not developed. And you can see, this is the Canal Saint-Denis, and I don't quite know the name of this basin off to the left, very stridently shown in blue. And then you see this is a major cylindrical 50,000 seat auditorium. And here are various sports facility auditoria built for different sports, water sports, badminton, basketball, etc., etc. But what is more interesting, I think, and this is my last slide, next, is there it is again, you see, and this is, well, Haussmann is over somewhere off to the right, and the Paris we all love, so to speak. And here is what is aggregated around Paris as it has aggregated around London. I mean, total chaos, like the route from central London to London City Airport. I mean, it's just, every time I do that route, I haven't done it for a long time. Chaos is just boggles the mind. And this is an urban intervention. It's full of a certain pathos. you know, I suppose, what is my final argument? I think we can't build, Mies is right, we can't build cities anymore, it's over. You know, we don't even have the desire to build them, by the way, because the last British new town was 1970, or inaugurated 72. I mean, forget about it, you know. And you know, it's interesting, you know, the change of name from the Ministry of Town and Country Planning, which is kind of obviously harking back to Ebenezer Howard after the Second World War. And it's changed, I can't remember the exact date, but it's in the 60s, I think, some point, to a Department of the Environment. I mean, this change in name says everything about the predicament we have created for ourselves, or rather, the predicament that capitalism has created for ourselves. You know, this is capitalism par excellence. That's it. Thank you.
Brilliant. Thank you, Ken, hugely. I think in order that we can have as much interaction as possible, I would just encourage those asking questions to keep them brief and focused, if possible, please. So I will pick up those who would like to ask a question, and let's move for about half an hour or so. Let's see how it goes. But thank you hugely. So many kind of issues that are almost alien to contemplate and think about, not least scale and the whole question of transport movement. So, who would like to start? Matthew, please.
Yeah, hi, thank you. Thank you so much, Kenneth Frampton, and thank you, Eric. Really stimulating and exciting. Many things to reflect on, but a sort of a dark future also that you paint for us here. This question, I think you said, forget about it. We don't know how to do cities, and obviously it's a provocative thing to say. But I think the issue of how to understand what it is we're dealing with in terms of cities, you've been very kind to us to remind us of some of the key let's say landmark schemes and reference points that we may have. But also, I think, especially at the moment with changes happening so fast, you mentioned Cairo, cities getting so much bigger, and cities like Cairo, Lagos, I don't know, Mumbai, cities that create a different kind of image for us, especially in the global south, and encourage us to think about the city in a way that creates, yes, ways of remembering maybe what we've lost, but also thinking about the future in ways that encourage us to embrace new imaginaries, especially the city, not so much as a place, but as a mobility. And as this phrase platform cities has very much come to dominate a lot of discussion recently, the idea that the city is a place that represents a platform created by digital technology and a place to step off to elsewhere. So I guess especially around this phrase that I remember very much being introduced to by Peter Carl at Cambridge, the idea of urban metabolism, and Achille Mbembe has picked it up recently. This idea that maybe we should think about the urban future in regard to not so much hanging on to those ideas of place, but ideas about movement and the energy and life that a city can still bring in amongst everything that has been lost. So not so much a question, but a provocation there about opening up the idea of a new paradigm.
Yes, well, but do we need designers for that? I doubt it. I mean, that is all the organism provides its own dynamic by itself. It doesn't need any intervention. That's how I would argue. What would we need intervention for? It's perfectly fine doing what it's doing. Then, the whole idea of architects and urban is total redundant. I mean, who needs that?
Succinct answer, Ken. Thank you. Can we turn to Christian, please?
Hi, Kenneth. Really interesting talk. I'm sort of reflecting on my own background at the moment in relation to cities, because I was born in Southend-on-Sea, which as of yesterday is now a city, partly due to the tragic death of the MP, but it, along with Croydon, for example, have been asking to become cities for a long time. And I suppose my question is a very simple one, is there's another question in our country at the moment, in the UK, which is what actually is a city anymore? Because if you can make Southend a city that has pretty much no cultural infrastructure at all, and that was there when I grew up is now no longer there, what is it that makes a city now? I mean, I'm not sure I understand that at all.
No, I think that I don't either. I mean, you know, of course, you're introducing that thing of the Southend wanting to become a city and Croydon, etc. It suggests to me, of course, it's a political project, and that I mean, are they going to? It used to be the case that you couldn't be a city without a cathedral. I feel it's unlikely that Croydon and Southend are going to build a cathedral. I mean, so, you know, clearly that's no longer the prerequisite for a city, since they're claiming to be cities. I mean, and it must be a political project. What else is it? You know, power in a way.
I mean, it's just in case when you compare it to perhaps Birmingham's arise as a city, which came after the reform movement, when the end of the rotten boroughs in 1832, when it actually meant something politically to become a city. Because up until that time, it was a city of 500,000. It had no political representation because it didn't have any historic member of parliament. And so, as you say, you know, if it is a political situation, then I can understand something like Birmingham becoming one. But I honestly still can't understand.
No, well, I mean, I think that the cultural prerequisite in the case of Birmingham, which is what I think you're implying, you know, was sort of justified, so to speak, the claim to be a city. And now you seem to be saying, you know, that's totally absent from Southend and from Croydon, more or less, and therefore it's just a political game, isn't it? What else is it? You know? I mean, it's just another fact that one can't dispute somehow, don't you think? It brings you back to the question: what is the city? You know, I mean, and you could say the same about the 3 volumes, The Endless City. I mean, is that still a city? I mean, mega cities are cities. But, you know, that's the incredible thing. I think I know a bit about Mexico City, 30 million people, right? It takes, you know, the poorer end, let's say, of the working force that work in the center of Mexico City, 2.5 hours commuting each way every day, you know, from the periphery to the center, you know, and there are many mega cities that have this characteristic, so that their lives are being burnt, you know, in commutation, right? Apart from the fact that they're not very well paid, you know, and this lack of political will, even to build public transport, vis-a-vis climate change, etc., etc. I mean, this is the pathos of our society. We don't have a radical political will, not in the United States for sure, because the United States is about to become fascist. But yeah.
Thanks.
Please, to follow. Peter, can we ask you, please, to pitch in?
Sorry, am I unmuted?
You're unmuted, yeah.
Ken, it's wonderful to hear you again. I still
Okay.
Ken was my first teacher in
Oh God.
I was one of his early students, and I did a horrible drawing for a crit, and he told me to make space and walked away. But
Actually, it wasn't very, I hope I improved after a while.
oh, absolutely. I still have the notes from your seminars.
Right. Yeah.
Oh, a quickie. I noticed that many of, I mean, the Bakama scheme was for Tel Aviv was one of the things that intrigued me. Well, in fact, I was at Princeton. And this business of orchestrating the ground seems to dominate the notion of the big scheme. And the sections seem to be quite banal. And I was wondering if you had an example. I mean, all I can think of is Shibuya, of a kind of vertical urbanism that works.
Yeah. I find it hard to think of. I
Mm.
don't know Shibuya, to tell you the truth, very well. I mean, there was this interesting project by Maki and Otaka for sort of artificial sites, that was in relation to railroad stations. And that brings up an interesting point, I think. Much more in Japan than in Europe, but the potential of the railroad station as a program, which of course brings us back to public transport, to function as a kind of energizer. I mean, I think one of the attractions of the city in miniature is it has a kind of urban intensity. It is a kind of there which is active, and alive. And of course, if one looks for programs for such this pathetic idea of megaforms, I think universities or transport stations or hospitals, for example. I mean, it's funny. Once one starts to go in that direction, one is left wondering why hospital design has become so unbelievably banal and bureaucratic. It's astonishing.
Yeah. David, I can see your thoughtfulness.
Thank
Share.
Thank you, Eric. As Peter and Ken were talking about it, I immediately thought of Shinjuku Station in Tokyo. Probably not a good example, but I do think there are a number of Japanese cases, even Maki himself, where the sectional understanding of topography is productive. My question can be preceded by a brief comment. I think, Ken, it's a very helpful insight for us to think about urban projects as city in miniature rather than big architecture.
Yeah.
But my question is whether or not you feel there's a different sense of the project when one passes from a building to a city in miniature, because many of the cases you showed, they did seem single authored, built in one go, as if a work of architecture got enlarged in size. Part of the issue, I'm sure, that you've raised is a matter of program, but mine is, I suppose, a more basic question about what we understand to be the nature of such a project and if you will, the singularity of intent, or is there another way to conceptualize this city in miniature coming into being?
Yeah, I find that very encouraging comment, because it makes me think, well, it takes me a bit back to Jerzy Zoltan's remark, when I mentioned in passing in Harvard, what would happen to surgery if it's never practiced, being a pointed comment about urban design. And we have I'm sure it's the same in England. Certainly it's true in the States, we still have these subsets of urban design and urban planning, which incidentally, of course, don't talk to each other, mostly. You know, but what is their project? You know, I think that your question, David, is a challenge to universities, to schools of environmental design, architecture, whatever, to actually rethink what could be a possible project. In order to have a project pedagogically that is also a project politically, polemically, you know, in face of a society which does not seem to have a project anymore. I mean, this reminds me of one other thing, is that I once had this exchange with Ziza about his work, and he said, I think I said something banal, like, you must be very happy because you have a lot of projects. And he wrote back a little laconic statement. Yes, it's true, I have a lot of projects, but I'm not happy. How can one be happy when Europe has no project? And I think it's a very profound remark, you know, because we live in societies without a project. I mean, Anglo-America, I think, is completely without a project. You know, and putting them together, maybe it's that could be very controversial in itself, but I think that, you know, what is the project? You know, what is imagined for the future of the society? And I think that it's a challenge to universities. Of course, universities would rather keep their noses clean, but inside departments, perhaps it's possible to try to ask this question: what is this? What could be a project, actually, you know, that would make a difference?
Thank you.
A deeply rhetorical moment. Yeah. I'm looking for others, but in a way, I'm intrigued. Just thinking back and to those lectures that I spoke about. There was one that you centered around the work of Adolphe Appia and the theatre and the city. Which I mean, that's 1976.
Yeah.
And I have a feeling that sort of question of megaform, you know, you could easily have inserted some of his work into this lecture, actually, you know, therefore the question of scale comes to my mind, and how you might react to that observation.
Yeah, that's also encouraging observation, because you know, well, I mean, I greatly admire the work of Appia, and excuse me, and the idea of a collect. I mean, the theatre, the idea of a theatre is a kind of collective concept already in itself, I think. And so to link this to David Leatherbarrow's remarks about program, I mean, it is a question of programming, of course, and that takes us back to to developing programs inside universities to hypothesize, you know, what can we make, what project can we develop as a theoretical project within the university, you know, a project that could be argued out, you know, with other ramifications, you know, like the advantage of a particular kind, this Russian term social condenser, a particular kind of social condenser that could also be, of course, the basis for commercial development and for other kinds of development, or for that matter, housing. For that matter, housing. Yes, composite program, and what would be the scale of that program, and what would? Yeah, I mean, I've totally forgotten that I gave a lecture on Appia, and a long time ago.
Well, happy to remind you. Very indeed. Yeah. No, any others? I think we've taken our time, but please. Yeah.
If I can mention that I'm not sure if you can see them on your screen, but two other guests, Anna Kim and Nicola Woon, both have their hands up. So perhaps they'd like to.
Can you therefore respond? Was it Anna and Nicola?
Might I jump in here? Sorry. Just speaking.
Sorry. Sorry. Can I jump in?
Please
Anna,
do, Nicola.
Oh, thank you. Anna Kim, I'm an art and architectural historian. I just wanted to pick up on a few threads that have to do with scale and the city in miniature and the project of architecture. I'm wondering if, going back to your title, Kenneth, could you say more about civitas? You haven't said much about it, and you know, thinking about what a city is and how it was originally defined by Aristotle and others in relation to the polis as being of a certain scale and having a civic function. You know, I'm sure this deeply informs architecture going forward. You know, this sort of idea of the city as shaping behavior and giving rise to a kind of civic life and ideal. And of course, Richard Sennett has written about this and many others. So I'm wondering if you could say a little bit about how civitas sits with or against or in tension with megacities and megaforms. I mean, what kind of civic life can we have in the megacity, in the megaform? And if the architect is the one who, well, let me ask this as a provocation. I mean, I agree with Matthew. We have a changing paradigm of cities coming from the global south. It's more sort of an instrumental idea of cities. And so if we humanists still have this ideal of the city, then what is our project?
Thank you.
Yes. Well, maybe it's one. We all have our limits, and one of my limits is the extent to which I will never escape the influence of Hannah Arendt and her concept of space of human appearance, which is also, of course, related to the polis and the idea of the political. And for her, you know, the workers' Soviets after the revolution, also for Heinrich Blücher, who was her partner, you know, that was a space. These were spaces of appearance, political spaces of appearance, which was repressed by the Bolshevik Party. That's also a fact. And that may seem to be an enormous digression, but I think that the point of an auditorium, a theater, a theatrical space, you know, is that it can also be a political space, and it's a space where people are brought together, you know, and that's yeah, you know, one example of this, which is a very concrete one, which is very political again, you know, is Sao Paulo. There is a woman who was mayor of Sao Paulo, member of Lula's Workers' Party, that during the, I can't remember how long she was mayor, but during her mayoralty, she built, I think, over 40 schools in favelas around Sao Paulo. You know, these favelas, as you know, I'm sure, you know, these spontaneous self-built housing conglomerations without any public space. And into them was inserted a school, but a school thought of as a school stroke community center, which would be open, you know, in the evenings and weekends, and would be a sort of micro university as well as carrying out, I mean, very ambitious school programs that she was able to achieve. I mean, I don't think she was mayor, like she was, what, 10 years or less mayor of that city, and built 40 schools in the middle of these places. You know. I mean, I think this is civitas. I mean, this is a way to begin, I think, with decentralized. I mean, the business of there's no more there is also there's no more collective core in much of the suburban megalopolis.
Yes.
Thank you.
Thank you.
That I'm not sure who pitched in, whether it was is it Nicola there?
Hi.
Coming in. Thank you. Hi.
Sorry, my name's Oscar, but we're speaking for
That's what I
studio here at
understand.
London
What
Met,
confusion.
so not
Yeah.
far from Christian.
Good.
Kenneth, I wanted to jump in because what Mr. Leatherbarrow said was very interesting, but you were also talking about sort of when you were driving from London to the City of London Airport, you talked about this nature of chaos and this idea of project, and looking at a lot of the megaforms, it often involves the idea of sort of the imposition of order on top of chaos. If you look almost in the sense of Hannah Arendt's Vita Activa and the pursuit of action as the interaction of humanity, might I ask a small question here, which is that maybe when looking at London's in the absence of projects, is that humans actually interact within chaos better than they do in some sort of architecturally imposed order? If you're looking in a Hobbesian sense, the political mass is pulled together from the individuals within the collective. Maybe that's in fact a better way for people to operate than in the sense of the megaform and the imposition of sort of structure on how people live, and that actually a more organic accumulation of people living together is maybe a more effective way of interacting in Hannah Arendt's idea of action and political engagement within her web of relationships.
Yeah, I think that's a valid observation, you know. Yes, I mean, you know, her whole argument is that as long as people live close together, the power will remain with them. You know. But, suburbanization, of course, is the total dispersal of peoples. You know, this dispersal is designed to keep them all from gathering any power. I mean, consciously or unconsciously. But I think your point about you're really sort of arguing that this physical form is irrelevant. Right, well, maybe it is. I mean, it just seems to me that for the sake of continuity and identity, some kind of place is necessary, because I think this volatile coming together of people and dispersal of people is easily overcome in some way or other. You know, we live in such a mediatic society. You know, the whole internet business, Facebook, etc., etc. This whole thing, you know, doesn't bode very well in the United States in relation to what is happening politically in the United States at this moment. And in fact, Facebook is as much part of the problem as it is any kind of solution. You know, it is the problem in many ways, and out of control, completely out of control.
Shall we ask Tracey first and then follow with Nicholas? Is that all right?
That's fine. Absolutely fine.
Thank you.
Sure. So thank you, everybody, so much. You know, during this conversation, I've been continuously thinking about the question of order, and it seems to be coming up over in the questions. You know, at the beginning, while Kenneth was speaking, I kept thinking about the question of public space, and that was really beautifully answered in the idea of an internal space which becomes the public space, like a theater or like the schools that you were mentioning. But the question of order and of a project which is systematizing, it raises a question for me about whether a vision has to be totalizing, as the architectural project when it's built all at once is. And if we think about that and the difference between that and the way that a city grows in an organic way, we can't sort of we can't really reconcile those two. And I'm, you know, so I'm thinking about, you know, the era after the master narrative has sort of passed into a fragmentary realm of more grassroots micro narratives, multiple voices, and wondering whether maybe there's a project on the horizon that we don't have, we haven't sort of discovered, or we don't have words for yet.
Yeah, I think that's a very, very interesting question. It somehow makes me think of this question of what is it? Maybe think of this question of land settlement, and you know, the yes, I mean, this is perhaps going too far away, but this issue of climate change, agriculture, land settlement, it brings us back to the political. I'm sorry to say, inevitably, but you know, as long as it's interesting that California has just, I think, eliminated zoning for single-family houses. I mean, it's not for the whole state, but also for large chunks of California. I think it's a move in the right direction, because suburbanization is a killer, in my opinion. You know? And as long as it goes on, which suits the oil and automotive industries perfectly at the moment, you know, it's just one profligate consumption of agricultural land. And this is going to become an issue, not immediately, but in the future, it will become an issue. I mean, all this suburbanized territory is lost agricultural land, and we're losing it at a colossal rate. And so you could say that my whole pathetic thing about Megaform is beside the point. Perhaps the real point is that this society does not know how to develop for itself a ecologically valid land settlement pattern, ecologically and socially valid pattern, land settlement pattern. And you know, it's a political hot potato, of course, you know.
I'm thinking of sorry, when Rome proposed its recent master plan, which I think was 2005, one of the terms that came up a lot was the polycentric city, where the idea of having kind of cultural poles, so having a loose structure without a kind of imposed structure. And I don't know, you know, again, if that's the answer everywhere, but it was, I thought, of a kind of a potentially rich way of thinking.
I think if one had a more rational land settlement pattern, those polycenters would be more, I don't know, more effectively brought into being.
Thank you. Nicholas Hyland.
Thanks. Yes, my question really goes back to the actual title of the series, A Living Memory of Cities. And I guess I'm kind of interested in how do we articulate from your perspective and deep uncertainty, and if I may say so, a certain kind of pessimism about the future of the city, or what we mean by city or urban life. How we address this question of continuity of memory, if indeed that even exists in many cities. The assumption that historic cities provide the conditions of that continuity, albeit sometimes ossified because of excessive preservation and preciousness to buildings that don't allow for change and adaptation. And I'm kind of interested in your analysis, I guess, of the Barcelona intervention on the Diagonale by Moneo and Morales. You spoke very positively about how this thing kind of exists within using the concept of the urban acupuncture kind of method of this what is a megastructure, mega form, but somehow is sympathetically inserted within the existing fabric of the Diagonale. and how it relates to the public face of the street, and of course the commercial sector of the atrium, and how that's done with a certain skill and panache of design. Is that enough? Is that a contributory factor to how we deal with this question of continuity of the city, so it doesn't undo and destroy the existing sense of belonging, the sense of place that has become such an issue of such concern in cities today?
Yes. This question of buildings as freestanding objects and height. Manhattan is, in my opinion, in the process of being destroyed by a high-rise, random, totally high-rise development with no height limit of any specific kind, no height limit at all. And I was very shocked recently to see a panorama of Sao Paulo, which is, after all, Brazil is not in the best of political shape, we could say. But it seems that Sao Paulo has stuck to a kind of height limit. And therefore, there is this kind of panoramic sense of continuity, but Canary Wharf, etc., and the Manhattanization of cities, is it's a very, very negative thing. And this horizontality of the form, I think, is important. And I would like also to add, that, of course, my coinage, or maybe other people, I can't remember, the coinage of megaform, then you get into the question of megastructure, and Rainer Banham, become megastructures. I mean, the whole glorification of megastructures, of which, Centre Pompidou is probably the most fundamental megastructure, and its form is it is sort of fairly horizontal, of course, but its form is not topographic in any way. It seems to be doesn't create a kind of formal continuity, and you could say this is just formalism, of course, and reduced to just that alone, it is a kind of formalism. But I think that this question of horizontality, I think, is important. Also in terms of land settlement, this question of horizontal continuity, I think, is important.
Thank you.
Formally and otherwise, yeah.
Thank you. Can I therefore draw us to a conclusion? It's an hour and a half, very intense, and thank you hugely, Ken, and thanks also for all your contributions. But I'm left with that requirement from Robin Middleton of a book that would be read by every student and recommended by all teachers. And yeah, I have to say, and many other levels, you've been supremely successful. But anyway, thanks hugely for tonight, and look forward to seeing you in London. Actually, to enjoying a bit of London when you're next here, please.
Yeah, there's still a lot left. I would say thank everybody for.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, everybody.
Thank you.